Hi, I'm Annalise. At my family's estate meeting, while my mother mocked the sketches I once made on old shipping boxes, a man in a tailored suit crossed the room and called me Attorney General. Not the artist, not the hobbyist. They laughed at my paintings, erased me from photos, locked me out of my studio, because they thought they knew who I was. But the truth was never about brushes or paint. It was about silence. What happens when the quiet one in the family turns out to be the one watching all along? The envelope had weight to it, not in ounces, but in memory. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, tucked neatly between a property tax bill and a local election flyer. Cream cardstock, bold serif font, and the Grant family crest embossed in gold foil. A formal estate meeting. My name, Annalise Drew, appeared dead center, flanked by the words, "Required attendance." I turned it over in my hand, half expecting to find a message scrawled on the back in my father's handwriting. Instead, inside the envelope, hidden behind the RSVP card, was a note from my mother. It wasn't a greeting. It wasn't even a sentence, just, "Bring your paintings. Maybe someone will take pity and buy one." There was no signature. Of course not. I sat in my studio in downtown Salem, Oregon, the early fall light casting fractured shadows through the window blinds. My brushes were still damp from the morning. Across the table lay a half-finished canvas, something abstract in navy and ochre, born from sleeplessness and too many internal monologues. I stared at the letter again. And I said aloud to no one in particular, "I've interrogated war criminals with more subtlety." That night, my burner phone buzzed once. Nothing unusual in my line of work. I picked it up, entered the code, and listened to the voice recording. "Maintain cover. You're being watched. No deviations." Even after years of fieldwork, it still jarred me. It wasn't fear. It was discipline. My identity as a low-income, emotionally unfulfilled painter wasn't just a cover anymore. It had become armor. On Thursday, I drove through the gates of the Grant estate. My hands didn't shake. My jaw didn't clench. I'd learned to hollow out reactions long ago. The estate hadn't changed. White columns, lavender hedges, and that suffocating perfection. The kind of place where nothing was allowed to fall out of place, especially not daughters. A valet opened the car door without looking at me. "Welcome, Ms. Drew." He said it like someone greeting a stranger at a hotel check-in desk. Inside, the dining room buzzed with the kind of chatter that only sounds polite if you aren't listening closely. I scanned for my name card on the long oak table. I found it at the far end, written in blue ballpoint pen. Every other card had been printed in gold calligraphy. The chair was a collapsible folding chair. No cushion, no armrest, just aluminum and silence. I sat down, smoothed the back of my coat, and let my eyes do the listening. Malis was already holding court near the fireplace, her voice a performative blend of casual laughter and subtle brag. "When you're handling portfolios worth 8 figures, there's no room for sentiment," she said, sipping Chardonnay like it was a stage prop. Isolde, my mother, was circling the table. She leaned toward one of my nieces and whispered something. The girl turned to look at me with a half smile, then looked away quickly. I heard it. Everyone did. "Don't ask her about her job. It's complicated." The tea placed in front of me was lukewarm. No one offered me wine. Devin Lang, the family lawyer, arrived 15 minutes late. He greeted everyone with a firm handshake and fake smile. When he reached me, he paused, just for a second too long. His right hand twitched at his side, almost like a bow was forming, but then he stopped himself. I smiled. He knows who I am. He knows who I really am. "Ms. Drew," he said carefully. I nodded. "Counselor." It was then I noticed the subtle gap in conversation. People had stopped whispering, not because they were done, but because they were watching. Malis glanced at me, then looked at our mother, a smirk spreading across her face like it had been waiting all night. She tapped a fork against her glass, not the polite clink for a toast, but 3 sharp taps like a gavel. "I just want to take a moment to appreciate the talent we have at the table," she announced. "Annalise still paints, bless her heart." A few smiles. "She brought some with her, I think. You should see the little things she makes, on cardboard." Laughter, soft, rehearsed, almost apologetic. The kind of laughter people give when they know they shouldn't laugh, but it's easier than staying silent. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I didn't offer a polite chuckle or raise my glass in self-deprecation. I sat in my folding chair with my pen-written name card and cold tea, and I absorbed it. They think silence is surrender. It isn't. I didn't speak. I didn't even reach for the glass of wine that hadn't been topped off once since I arrived. The laughter around the table softened just enough to feel like a slap wrapped in velvet. Malis was beaming, leaning into her spotlight like she'd been waiting for this all day. My mother, Isolde, always the queen of timing, reached into her handbag. "Oh, I almost forgot," she said, her voice dripping with that false cheerfulness she reserved for publicly measured humiliation. "You all remember this?" She pulled out a folded flyer, creased but carefully kept. She held it in the air like a winning lottery ticket. "It's from that little art walk downtown. You know, the one they used to do in those abandoned warehouse spaces. Annalise's first exhibit. Look at this. She even used recycled materials. That sketch of a woman on an Amazon box," she chuckled. "We called it the Cardboard Madonna." The room rippled again with laughter, this time louder, politer. More uncomfortable. I stared straight ahead, the flyer now a paper weapon in my mother's hand. My spine stiffened. I remembered that sketch. I'd made it the winter after Dad died, when I could barely afford heating in my apartment. That Amazon box had been what my groceries came in. It had been all I had to draw on. They turned my survival into a joke. My niece, Lila, 14 and too perceptive, looked up from her phone and asked quietly, "Why does your invitation say hobbyist? Everybody else has their job title." I turned to her. Her question wasn't mean. It was sincere, innocent. It was worse that way. I didn't answer, not out loud. Instead, I scanned the room again. Devin Lang, the family lawyer, was seated next to my cousin Andrew. He was dabbing his forehead with a linen napkin like it had suddenly turned into a courtroom cross-examination. Our eyes met for half a second. He looked away immediately. My name had been left off the family tree plaque in the hallway, too. That had been the first red flag when I walked in earlier. But I'd brushed it off as a clerical error. Not anymore. This wasn't an oversight. It was orchestration. Midway through dinner, a server leaned down and murmured something to me. "Mrs. Grant asked if you'd step into the hallway. She wants a quick word." I followed the server out, not because I was obedient, but because when someone keeps poking at you in public, you start to wonder what they're hiding in private. Isolde stood near the staircase, arms folded, pearls perfectly aligned. The air smelled faintly of rose and disdain. "I know it's not easy," she said without preamble, "being around everyone, seeing how different paths can turn out." She didn't wait for me to respond. "We just want you to feel useful, Annalise. Everyone knows you're sensitive." She smiled like she was delivering comfort. But the edge in her tone sliced right through the act. "I'm not here to be useful," I replied evenly. "And I'm not here for your version of compassion." "Oh, honey," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. We all have roles to play. Yours just happens to be quieter. I didn't respond. There was no point. I turned to leave. She didn't follow. As I re-entered the dining room, Malis was standing, clutching a thin white envelope like it was an Oscar speech. She handed it to me with a forced softness. Mom thought you should see this tonight. I opened it at the end of the table while they resumed their wine and whispers. Inside was a printed document, a revised estate distribution draft. Bolded, underlined, non-financial beneficiary, Annalise Drew. A line beneath, may receive personal memorabilia as agreed upon. I blinked once. No land, no equity, no ownership. Just an acknowledgement that I might get to keep some of the memories if I behaved well enough. Malis leaned in, her voice coated in syrup. Art's not really an asset. You understand? She smiled, tapped the edge of her glass against mine, and turned back to her seat. I stared at that envelope, but it wasn't the paper that hurt. It was what they thought I'd do with it. I held the envelope in my lap like it might burn through the fabric. The words non-financial beneficiary were printed in clean serif type, like it had been chosen to sound gracious while saying absolutely nothing. I didn't feel rage, not the kind that shakes you. What I felt was worse. It was the low, slow confirmation that they had planned this, that someone, somewhere between cocktail hours and committee fundraisers, had decided I didn't count. They wanted it to feel official. I placed the envelope beside my untouched wine and scanned the room. No one was watching now. The performance had ended. The audience had moved on. The air had thickened since the toast. Laughter had become background noise, faint and forced. I rose slowly, steadying my breath, and made my way around the table's edge toward Devin Lang. He was halfway through his second glass of something red and expensive, too busy pretending to laugh at a story Malis was telling to notice me at first. Devin, I said, low enough not to interrupt but clear enough to cut. He looked up too quickly. Ms. Drew, he said with a smile that didn't quite land. You were in my ethics seminar, weren't you? Georgetown? Spring '09? He blinked. No. I studied under Judge Colton. Funny, I said, tilting my head. That's what you called me too. The silence between us lasted just long enough to become a threat. Then he cleared his throat, adjusted his cufflink, and excused himself with the grace of a man hoping no one else had heard. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. Instead, I drifted through the main hallway, letting my feet take me where they wanted. They brought me to the family gallery, a long corridor filled with black and white portraits, plaques, newspaper clippings in golden frames, the legacy wall, the shrine. Malis, in a red sheath dress, shaking hands with a state senator. Isolde, receiving a humanitarian award from the city council. My father's funeral program framed beneath a folded flag. And me? Nowhere. Not at my law school graduation, not in the photo from the gala I organized, not even in the candid shot of all the grandkids at the beach, because I was the one holding the camera. I stood in front of that wall until someone behind me cleared their throat. I didn't turn. I just said, I wasn't erased. Silence. I was never meant to be visible in the first place. I stepped out into the hallway and drifted to the side parlor, the one my father used to read in. It was quiet now, full of soft lamplight and the scent of dust and lemon polish. I sat on the edge of a leather armchair, hands folded in my lap, and closed my eyes. Memory doesn't knock. It just walks in. A bench. Hard wood. Cold. The echo of footsteps behind me. A whisper, low and sharp. He's tied to your mother's board. Paper rustling. A voice I trusted saying, You want to clean house? Start with your own. A wiretap. My name. Not just mentioned, but leveraged. I opened my eyes. That had been the moment I knew, when I understood the depth of what they were capable of and what I had to become to stop it. As I returned toward the dining room, Devon caught up with me near the entryway. His face was pale, his posture smaller somehow. "They made me change the draft," he said, barely above a whisper. "I had no choice." I stopped, looked him in the eyes. "Everyone has a choice," I said. "Yours was cowardice." My phone vibrated in my clutch. I slid it open, glanced at the screen. Unknown number. They accessed the old fund. "Do not react yet. Watch who signs." I slipped the phone back into my coat pocket and finally looked up, straight into Melis's eyes. Melis didn't flinch when our eyes locked. If anything, she smirked like she'd won something I hadn't realized we were competing for. I slid the phone back into my coat pocket slowly, keeping my expression neutral. That message wasn't just a warning, it was a chess clock ticking down. They access the old fund. Do not react yet. Watch who signs. I took a sip of my wine, now lukewarm. Melis never signed anything unless it lined her pockets or cemented her place at someone else's expense. She was the hand, but someone else was the mind. Someone who knew where to move each piece. I needed to know who was behind that mind. The doors to the dining room creaked open. A maid, young and visibly uncomfortable, entered carrying a medium-sized cardboard box wrapped in clear tape. On the side, in black Sharpie, were the words, "Return to sender, unclaimed art." She set it gently beside my chair, whispered, "Sorry, ma'am," and disappeared as quickly as she'd come. The box was familiar, too familiar. Melis tilted her head as if just noticing. "Oh," she said with theatrical surprise, "you still have pieces floating around? I didn't think any gallery kept them past the month." Her voice danced with that cruel amusement she'd perfected in prep school. I said nothing. I didn't need to. But I held her gaze long enough to make her eyes dart away first. That was enough for now. I ran a finger along the edge of the tape, not opening the box, just remembering. That art was part of my constructed life, the one I'd built brick by quiet brick to shield the part of me that had to stay unseen. And now, even that had been dismantled, piece by piece. I didn't need more evidence that this meeting was a performance. The props had been chosen, the lines rehearsed. All I had to do was wait for the reveal. I excused myself and walked through the hallway toward the coat check, pretending I was looking for my phone charger. Instead, I let my thoughts unwind. The air smelled like expensive candles and old decisions. A flash from 2 weeks ago floated up, arriving at my Portland studio to find the locks changed, the nameplate scraped off the door. The building manager had looked apologetic, even embarrassed. "We received documents," he said, "signed and notarized, said you'd vacated permanently. It looked official. It came from your mother's foundation." He hadn't met my eyes when he said it. It all made sense now. First, strip the resources, then erase the image. Last, bury the name under paperwork and indifference. Classic. I pulled out my second phone, the one with no contacts and no apps, and typed the message carefully. "Target may be Melis. Will confirm signature on old fund. Need asset freeze protocol standby." I watched the screen until the message encrypted and disappeared. Then I tucked it back into the lining of my coat and returned to the dining room with the same pace I'd use walking into court. The lighting had dimmed slightly, candles now glowing on the long mahogany table. Conversations had turned shallow again, weather, politics, scandal rumors from someone else's city. Isolde stood at the head of the table, adjusting her scarf like it was a crown. She reached into her handbag, again, and this time pulled out a checkbook, old-fashioned, leather-bound, burgundy with gold initials. The kind of thing someone carries when they want you to notice the money, not the gesture. She flipped it open, tore out a check with a deliberate flourish, then passed it to the waiter with quiet instructions. I didn't care about the amount. But when she handed over the stub, I leaned forward casually, resting my elbow on the table, and caught a glimpse of the routing number. My stomach didn't drop. My heart didn't race. I just knew. I had memorized that number weeks ago. It belonged to a shell company registered to a defunct foundation in Nevada, a name that had popped up during a federal probe and mysteriously vanished from public filings. A dead corporation laundering live cash. They weren't just making charitable contributions. They were moving funds, dirty, deliberate, and now documented. I swirled the last sip of wine in my glass, feeling the rhythm of the room shift again. No one saw what I saw, but I wasn't alone. She didn't see me watching, but someone else did, and he was already walking toward the table. The sun had dipped just low enough to cast long gold streaks across the dining room, softening everything but the tension. Malis sat 2 chairs down, her fingers dancing along the rim of her wine glass in tight, distracted circles. That smile she wore all afternoon, polished, composed, was starting to crack at the corners. Not from guilt, from preparation. She wasn't sorry. She was bracing. Across the room, a cousin, Jeremy, I think, let out a half laugh and nudged his partner's shoulder. "Hey, is this you?" he said, raising his phone like a trophy. He tapped the screen a few times and then turned it outward. The screen showed a grainy thumbnail of one of my older paintings, listed on a discount art resale site. The title read, "Anonymous Cardboard Elegy." The caption below, "Produced by a reclusive hobbyist, unverified authenticity." Laughter bubbled up around the table. Not loud, not cruel, but enough to sting. Enough to make it clear someone in this room had gone out of their way to humiliate me on the internet, and now, in person. Isolde, ever the tactician of subtle slaps, murmured just loud enough for half the table to hear, "Maybe this is why you should have stuck to law school." I looked at Lila, my niece, still staring at the screen in Jeremy's hand with an uncertain grimace. "Did you know," I said evenly, "that your aunt has 3 offshore accounts under shell corporations? Maybe someday I'll list those for resale too." Jeremy choked on his drink. Isolde's eyes snapped to mine. Malis said nothing, but the rim of her glass stopped moving. That was all the confirmation I needed. I leaned toward Malis slightly, my voice so low it barely registered as a threat. "The account you used," I said, "the routing number ends in 4182. Do you want to know who owns that?" Her smirk twitched. She didn't answer, but she looked, to Isolde. That flicker was everything. I reached for my phone without taking my eyes off her. I typed slowly, carefully. Pattern confirmed. Suggest targeting shell cascade. Send. Encrypt. Gone. And just like that, the wire beneath the table lit up. The rest of the dinner blurred. The roast duck, the perfunctory small talk, the sound of forks on china. All of it faded behind the hum of calculation in my head. Later, I stood near the hallway, ostensibly checking messages. Malis slipped in behind me, her heels silent on the marble. "You're bluffing," she said, leaning casually against the doorframe like we were schoolgirls sharing secrets. "And if you're not, you'll bring down your own name, your own legacy." I didn't turn. "This legacy isn't mine," I said. "You sold it the day you laundered through Dad's death fund." Her breath caught, just for a second. Then she straightened, brushed imaginary lint off her shoulder, and walked away. I returned to the dining room through the side entrance. The air had shifted again. Conversations had grown more hushed, as if everyone was waiting for something but no one wanted to admit it. I was heading toward the coat closet when a young server gently tapped my elbow. "Excuse me," he said, hesitant but sure. "I'm sorry to bother. You're Annalise, right?" I nodded, already expecting another pointed comment or perhaps a misdirected toast. But instead, he smiled. It was genuine, and it shook something loose in my chest. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said. "What you did last year in Lane County. You don't know me, but you saved my father's life." I blinked. I had no words. He gave me a small, respectful nod and disappeared before I could ask anything. I stood there, next to the fireplace, surrounded by old portraits and manufactured conversations, and thought, even when you hide, the truth knows how to find you. The air had cooled, but the heat between us simmered just beneath the surface. The family had drifted outside for drinks and forced laughter on the back terrace, framed by string lights and polished stone balustrades. Sunset made everything look golden. Picturesque, if you didn't know what it cost to make it look effortless. Malis stood by the makeshift bar, swirling something with too much citrus and too little alcohol. She clinked her glass with a silver fork and raised it toward the guests. "To legacies," she began, her voice smooth, poised, "the ones we inherit, and the ones we invent when the first don't work out." Polite laughter trickled around the circle. Some found it witty, some found it petty. I found it timed. I looked across the space at Devin Lang. The man had gone ghost white. He fumbled his drink and pressed his napkin against his forehead like he could wipe away the implications of Malis's toast. I stepped forward before the mood could settle, lifting my own glass. "To legacies," I said, voice steady but low enough to command stillness, "and to knowing which signatures are admissible in probate court and which are forgeries." The laughter stopped. Utensils froze mid-air. My words dropped like coins into an empty well, echoing, undeniable. I reached into my clutch and pulled out 2 pieces of paper folded together, then gently unfolded them for everyone to see. "One of these," I said, turning slightly toward Isolde, "is the original draft of my father's estate plan. The other, well, the other could cost someone in this room their legal license." A glass shattered near the far table. No one turned to see who dropped it. Malis's expression didn't change, but her fingers tensed around her drink. She knew where I was going. I kept going. "You used a legacy account," I said to her directly, "tied to a charitable trust. In your name." The moment that routing number hit our system, it triggered a federal alert. You didn't just move money, you forged memory. You desecrated it. Malis opened her mouth, but I didn't give her the space. "And you used Dad's name. You dragged him into this, again, after we laid him to rest. After you cried in front of cameras, after you made a speech about honor and heritage, you buried him again, but this time with greed." Silence hung between us. It wasn't awkward. It was sacred. I folded the papers slowly and returned them to my clutch. I didn't yell. I didn't storm out. That wasn't what this was. This wasn't theater. This was record. I didn't come here to fight. I came to finish collecting the evidence. I took one step back, then another. I was almost to the exit when it happened. Malis's voice, sharper than it had been all evening, rang across the terrace. "You think this makes you look noble, Falcon?" The sound cut through the quiet like she'd fired a flare gun into the dark. Heads turned, eyes widened. A woman near the garden arch whispered, "What did she just call her?" I didn't turn around, but I did smile, because someone else had heard it too. I didn't flinch when Malis said it. I didn't gasp or freeze or ask her to repeat it. I just stood there, surrounded by guests pretending to admire twinkle lights and manicured hedges, knowing full well the damage had already been done. Falcon. She hadn't guessed that name. That name had never left a single public record. Someone told her, and that someone had access they shouldn't. A shiver of awareness slid down my back. Not fear, not surprise, but the realization that this game wasn't being played in shadows anymore. It was being played in full view. I turned toward the garden's edge, where a few cousins had gathered around a phone. My feet moved on instinct, slow but deliberate. "Annalise?" one of them said, holding the phone out. Have you seen this?" I leaned in. It was a blog post, slick, anonymous, designed to look like a conspiracy site but written with insider knowledge. "Who is Annalise Drew, really?" the headline mocked. Beneath it were several grainy black and white images, one of me stepping out of a courthouse in D.C., another of me in tactical gear entering a warehouse in Tacoma. These weren't photos taken by a journalist or a stranger on the street. These were surveillance grade, military. "These aren't even online," I murmured. "They're sealed." "Then how'd they get them?" my cousin asked, eyes wide. "Someone inside accessed sealed files, and someone in this house shared them." I didn't answer. I turned and walked toward the east parlor, my breath steady, my mind moving like a clean blade through fog. The room was empty, save for one of my older paintings, abstract, layered in brushstrokes that looked decorative to anyone who wasn't trained to see otherwise. Melis had hung it like a trophy, titled it Echoes of the House. But I knew the pattern. It wasn't just color, it was code. Years ago, I had embedded Delta One cipher sequences into my artwork as a safety net, a way to transmit location data under the guise of expression. No one outside the field would notice. But this wasn't buried in my storage. It was here, displayed, used. She didn't just steal my work, she used it as cover. My phone vibrated in my coat. A message from R, the one contact I still hadn't dared call by name. "Confirm Delta One embedded. If yes, ops may be active through it. Your name is being used." I stared at the painting for another second, then typed back. "Confirmed. Layer 4. She's using the cipher. I'm pulling jurisdiction." I stepped out onto the garden path again. The crowd had loosened, people drifting to desserts, whispers rippling like soft jazz through the hedges. I caught sight of Melis by the fountain, sipping her drink like nothing had just detonated around her. I approached, slowly. She didn't blink. "Walk away, Annalise." I said nothing. "Take your memories. Your little canvases disappear before the headlines write themselves." I looked at her face, so familiar, so polished. All our childhood photos came rushing back in a single frame, but they meant nothing now. "You don't want to be in a headline next week," she added, her voice colder. I stepped closer. "Just enough." "Neither do you," I said. "But the difference is, I don't need to write your name in ink." I leaned in, voice low. "You already wrote it in blood." She opened her mouth, closed it, and for the first time since I arrived, she looked unsure. I turned and walked away, not fast, not slow, just certain. I didn't sleep that night, but someone else did. And while they slept, I built the opening to burn their bridge. The ballroom smelled like smoke and sugar. Half the candles had burned down to stubs. Wine glasses stood abandoned on half-empty tables. Conversations had fractured into low murmurs that came in waves, never quite rising above the weight that had settled into the room. I stood near the arched exit, coat draped over my arm, watching Melis from a distance. She was boxed in by whispers and darting glances, her cocktail untouched in one hand, the other clutching her phone like it might save her. No one stood too close, not anymore. Truth doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just makes people vanish. Isolde appeared beside me without a word. Her eyes weren't red. She hadn't cried. But something in her expression had cracked, glass beneath pressure. She didn't look at me when she spoke. "You planned all of this?" Her voice didn't carry anger. It carried exhaustion. I answered evenly, without ceremony. "No, you did. I just didn't let it stay buried." She didn't argue, didn't deny. Her silence was confirmation enough. She turned and walked away with a grace that had once seemed regal. Now it felt rehearsed, like a speech she could no longer remember the ending to. Devin Lang was gone. Slipped out quietly after the toast debacle, after the whispers turned from curiosity to accusation. Someone later said they saw him in the parking lot on the phone, pacing like a man whose next call would be to his attorney. Malis tried one last time. She cut through the crowd, moving toward me with that same calculated poise she used on donors and board members. But before she reached me, Senator Boyd stepped into her path and gently, firmly guided her away. His words were low, inaudible, but her face told me everything I needed. It wasn't a negotiation. Somewhere behind me, a guest asked, too loudly, "Is the FBI here right now?" The question landed like a stone. No one answered, but no one laughed either. I stepped out into the cold. The air hit like truth, sharp and bracing. I wrapped my coat tighter and walked down the garden path, away from the noise, the lights, the stairs. Halfway to the car, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. It was Lorraine, a former board member from my mother's charity. She had always smiled at me with that brand of warmth you save for children who don't belong at adult tables. "You gave up everything to do this," she said, pulling her shawl tighter around her. "You know that, right? They'll never thank you." I met her gaze. "I didn't do it for gratitude," I said. "I did it because the truth never negotiates." She blinked, nodded once, and walked away. I made it to my car and paused before opening the door. That was when I saw it. A note tucked under the windshield. No envelope, just folded, weighted by a stone. I opened it slowly. "Your father would have been proud, A." There was no full name, no hint. But the handwriting was familiar in a way that made my throat tighten. I folded the note carefully and tucked it inside my coat pocket. Maybe I didn't lose a family tonight. Maybe I finally left the wrong one. Rain tapped gently on the window pane, an almost polite reminder that the world had kept moving. Outside, Salem was gray and slow, the kind of weather that made the city feel like it was holding its breath. Inside the Airbnb loft, I sat cross-legged on the couch, a mug of black coffee going cold in my hands, the television on mute. Headlines scrolled across the bottom of the screen in red. State AG exposes financial misconduct in prominent family trust. They didn't name me, not yet, but I was the source, the match, the slow burn, the inevitable fire. My phone vibrated against the table. Another message. I didn't check who it was from. Not that I needed to. There were over 30 unread texts. Some were questions, some apologies, and a handful, I suspected, were threats wrapped in civility, but none from Isolde, none from Malis. Sometimes silence isn't retreat. Sometimes it's how power gets passed. My second phone rang, the one I kept for real work. No contacts, no photos, no apps, just protocol. "Kane," the voice said, "the department's greenlit formal asset review. You're clear to speak if you want to. The story's yours now." I didn't say much, just understood. Before the call ended, he added, "They froze 3 of the shell entities this morning. More coming. You held the line, Drew." A text followed moments later from Senator Boyd. You didn't just expose a system, you exposed a culture. That takes spine. Don't mistake this for sympathy, it's respect. I set the phone down and exhaled long and deep, letting my shoulders finally release the tension I'd carried since the night of the terrace toast. By noon, I'd already seen 2 cousins post stories on Instagram. Not about me, of course, but close enough. Sometimes family isn't blood. Sometimes it's just the name you're forced to carry. Nice try, I thought. Scrub the blood, but leave the bruises. A knock at the door startled me. It was Clara, the longtime housekeeper from the Grant estate. She looked older in the daylight, smaller too, holding a sealed cardboard box. He asked me to keep this for you, she said. Years ago, said you'd know when you'd earned it. Inside the box was a leather ID wallet, my father's, the one he used in court, worn but well kept. Tucked inside, a handwritten note. Keep going until they have no choice but to see you. I sat with that note for longer than I should have. Then, I slipped the ID into my bag. That afternoon, I wandered through a local gallery off Liberty Street, dressed down in a plain coat and no makeup. I wasn't hiding. I just didn't need to be seen. One of my earlier pieces, under my pseudonym, was hanging near the back, bathed in warm light. A woman stood staring at it, arms folded across her chest. There's something about this one, she said to no one in particular. Whoever painted it, they've seen justice and heartbreak. And they chose both. She turned, eyes meeting mine briefly. She didn't recognize me. I smiled faintly. I didn't choose heartbreak, I said, but I did choose the truth. As I stepped back out into the rain, a buzz lit up from my phone. Not the DOJ, not a friend. An encrypted message from an agency I'd worked with once, years ago. We saw what you did. There's a room in Langley that needs your judgment. Let us know when you're ready. I looked out over the soaked street, the storm easing just a little, and whispered, not today. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to answer immediately. A week passed. Not a long time by most measures, but long enough to quiet a storm. The headlines faded. The whispers dulled. And I found myself in a quiet cafe near the Willamette River, fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug that had long since gone warm. No one in the room knew my name. Not the real one. Not the one they'd whispered behind closed doors, and not the one that once lived in courtrooms. And yet, it was the most peaceful I'd felt in years. I hadn't spoken to Isolde or Melis. I hadn't heard from them either. That wasn't surprising. They were used to controlling the narrative. And when you can't control someone, you erase them. But I was done letting silence define me. Grief doesn't always come when someone dies. Sometimes, it comes when something false finally breaks, and you realize the relief in no longer pretending. I pulled out my notebook, one I hadn't used in years, faded green cover, frayed binding. Inside were blank pages I'd always meant to fill. Today, I did. I wrote 3 letters. The first, to my mother, was sharp, honest, but not cruel. I told her that dignity is not the absence of mistakes, but the ability to own them, that I never needed her approval, just her honesty. The second, to my father, was harder. He was gone, but his shadow had lived in every decision I made. I told him I wished he'd left louder footprints. I told him I became something no one in the family expected, not because I had to, but because someone had to. The third, to Melis, was only 2 lines. I'm not the shadow you painted. I'm the light you couldn't dim. I folded each letter carefully, slid them into the back of the notebook, and tucked it back into my bag. I had no plans to send them. Some things are meant to be written, not delivered. Forgiveness doesn't mean handing back the key. It means unlocking the door from your side and walking out without waiting for it to close behind you. Later that day, a local op-ed caught my eye. Someone had written anonymously in the small community column, "When justice lives in the same house as betrayal, one must leave to let truth breathe." I smiled at the phrasing. Someone understood, maybe more than one. The phone rang once that evening, a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened back, it was a woman's voice, elderly, firm, familiar. "We always knew something was off. You gave it a name. That matters." I didn't return the call. Some acknowledgments don't require dialogue. The next morning, I passed by the community center near the square, the same place the young server had whispered his thank you weeks ago. This time, I didn't just walk past, I stepped inside. The walls were painted in soft tones, blue, moss, gray. In the far corner, kids were sitting cross-legged in a semicircle. In front of them hung a mural, one of mine, abstract, coded, anonymous. A small girl, maybe 9, looked up at me, then pointed at the painting. "She's the one who sees everything," she told the boy next to her, "but doesn't tell on you." I couldn't help but smile. "Maybe," I whispered, "that's who I've been all along." That evening, I returned to my loft, the rain soft but persistent, as if trying to remind the city not to forget too fast. The elevator creaked like it always did, and the hallway smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. In my mailbox was a plain white envelope, no stamp, no return address, just folded neatly, slid into the metal slot. Inside was a photo, faded, decades old. My father holding me as a toddler, both of us caught in a moment of unguarded laughter. Behind it, a card. 5 handwritten words. You never had to prove it. No signature. But I didn't need one, and I knew whatever came next, I was already someone I could live with. The crowd outside the courthouse wasn't angry. It wasn't cheering either. It was quiet, watchful. The kind of silence people reserve for things that force them to rethink everything they believed about power. I stood near the edge of the steps, not needing the spotlight, not wanting the cameras. From this distance, I could still hear the clicks of shutters, the shifting of microphones, the barely restrained buzz of live news coverage. But I wasn't part of the story anymore, not the way they'd expected. Mayless descended the courthouse steps in cuffs. Her chin was lifted, her eyes glassy. She walked like she still owned the sidewalk beneath her. Isolde followed behind, smaller than I had ever seen her, dressed in her usual cream-colored blazer. But this time, it didn't look tailored. It looked borrowed, loose, like the identity she'd worn all her life had finally slipped off the hanger. The district attorney stepped forward. This investigation began when one woman refused to let silence cover up corruption. And today we close a chapter not just in legal terms, but in truth. I didn't smile, I didn't nod, I just listened, hands tucked in the pockets of my coat, wind brushing hair across my cheek. I wasn't there to be seen, just to make sure the end really happened. They asked me later, "How did you take them down?" And I said the truth. I didn't destroy them. They dismantled themselves. That evening, a nationally televised segment aired. Not planned by me, but inevitable once records became public. The segment title, "The Woman Behind the Frame." A voiceover recounted events, financial deceit, shell companies, illicit routing. But the twist that caught the nation off guard wasn't the fraud. It was the cover, an artist working quietly behind the veil of a gallery. They called her Falcon, the reporter said. But the world came to know her as Annalise Drew. The final shot panned to a gallery installation titled Inheritance, signed, sealed, erased. There was no plaque, no introduction, just a voiceover, mine. They made me the frame. I built the gallery. I turned off the TV before the credits finished rolling. I didn't need to watch the reactions. The next day, I met Senator Boyd in a quiet office on the Hill. The walls smelled of old paper and coffee beans. "You could have gone scorched earth," he said, pouring us both tea. "You didn't." "I didn't want them gone," I said softly. "I just needed them to stop writing my story." He smiled in that rare, unguarded way. "There's a formal DOJ position if you want it. Clean slate. Your name, your terms." I looked at the offer in front of me, then back out the window at the Capitol Dome. "No," I said. "I think I'll write something else now." And I did. That weekend, I walked through a local art fair anonymously, baseball cap low, jeans paint-speckled by design. I stopped near one of my pieces, unsigned but unmistakable. A child sat nearby, sketching her own version, tongue poking slightly from the corner of her mouth. "That painting?" the girl's mother said to another passerby. "It's from a woman who helped people see what others tried to bury." The words stopped me mid-step. I turned, just slightly. "Maybe that's all art ever was," I whispered. Later that night, after the fair had packed up and the breeze had cooled, I returned to my loft. The lights blinked on slowly, as if waking with me. I dropped my keys, made tea, and found one final envelope slipped through the mail slot. No name, no return address. Inside, a folded canvas, the cardboard Madonna. My first, my rawest. The piece I'd drawn with nothing but a sharp pencil and grief. And a note. 5 words, all that was needed. "The world tried to frame you. I always knew you were the artist." It was signed, just with his name, my father's. I walked to the window, the canvas tucked under my arm, the wind tugging gently at my coat. Somewhere below, traffic hummed. Life moved on. "They didn't steal my legacy," I whispered. "They confirmed it.